like to turn to the book of Isaiah. We'll be in the 35th chapter. Just by way of background, Isaiah ministered to the southern kingdom of Judah. His ministry began near the end of Uzziah's reign, continued through the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. It was during the reign of Jotham that Assyria was systematically sweeping through the east, absorbing and destroying whole cultures, whole nations, and would conquer the northern kingdom of Israel. At that time, the southern kingdom, of course, was being threatened by Assyria, and Isaiah preached to them during that time. He warns them of God's coming judgment due to the fact that they were guilty of the very same sins of the northern kingdom. Time was running out for the southern kingdom. They were in desperate need of hope. And Isaiah prophesied some 750 years before Christ. And to give them hope, he does not promise them some economic shift that would bring relief to God's people. He does not speak of enemy nations crumbling for the benefit of his people. But in order to provide hope, he looks forward to a coming one, a God-sent one, whose presence and power would make a difference. Isaiah's message was one of coming captivity due to sin, but also of deliverance. Isaiah's message was one of God's judgment. It was also a message of God's mercy and God's grace. Isaiah knew that the kings and the prophets and the priests of the nation had all failed. And he was moved, again, by the Holy Spirit, 700 plus years ahead in time, to preach concerning the coming of one man who would not fail, Jesus Christ, the great King of Kings, the perfect prophet and priest, the Son of God. And what we see throughout the book of Isaiah is that mankind, due to sin, is ruined, is miserable, with no hope, with no help, with no remedy, no answer. But Isaiah brings into view, in the midst of all the madness, this one who would be the only hope and the only help and the only answer for the nation. One who could change the heart of man. One who could deliver the soul of the miserable. One who could remedy the sin of the depraved heart. So as you read the book of Isaiah, he has a very clear vision of this coming one, Jesus Christ. And he points to him throughout the book. He speaks of him as the branch of the Lord. Refers to him as Emmanuel, or God with us. Refers to him as the glory of the Lord, and as God's elect, as God's righteous servant, as the light, as the liberator, as God's provided substitute, as our sin bearer, and the offering for sin. He refers to him as salvation itself and as the Redeemer. Isaiah, again, is writing a message of hope, and he points to this coming Christ. And that is the hope today. That is the only hope today. The overall theme of the book of Isaiah, the overall theme of Isaiah's ministry, corresponds to the meaning of Isaiah's name. Jehovah is salvation. And that's pretty much the theme of the book. It's pretty much the theme of Isaiah's ministry. It was a message of hope. It was a message of expectation because of Christ. And we, the saved, ought to be living a life of hope, ought to be living a life of great expectation because of Christ. Isaiah 35, we'll read the first 7 verses. The wilderness and the solitary place shall be glad for them, and the desert shall rejoice and blossom as the rose. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice, even with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given it, the excellency of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord and the excellency of our God. Strengthen ye the weak hands, and confirm the feeble knees. Say to them that are fearful heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, even God with a recompense. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap as an hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing. For in the wilderness shall waters break out, and streams in the desert. And the parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water, in the habitation of dragons. Where each lay shall be grass with reeds and rushes. Now what we read here, of course, follows what we read in chapter 34. If you read chapter 34, you see that it is a chapter all about the indignation and the fury of the Lord in judgment. Everything in chapter 34 is God's coming judgment. Everything in chapter 34 is very, very dark. But then you come to this 35th chapter, and you see God coming to deliver and to restore His people. This 35th chapter is about a miraculous transformation. Isaiah, in this chapter, sees into the future, way, way down the line into the millennial kingdom. And I believe the 35th chapter is a prophecy of the millennial reign of Christ. It is a millennial promise, but has as common with the Word of God. There are a variety of spiritual applications. This 35th chapter can be viewed as a prophecy of the restoration of Judah from Babylonian captivity. And I believe in type, it is a picture of such. What we read here in Isaiah 35 can be viewed as a prophecy of Christ's incarnation and His saving and restoring power. A picture of the fact that Jesus changes things. And I believe in type that it is a picture of such. This 35th chapter can be viewed as a picture of salvation and as a picture of revival for God's people. I believe it's an excellent picture of what takes place in a real God-sent revival. But today when you and I read the book of Isaiah, we know that Isaiah's message goes beyond the southern kingdom of Judah. It goes beyond Babylonian captivity to God's people today. And there is spiritual application for today. Though it is a millennial promise, there is spiritual application for today. This is always true in God's Word. And I believe what we see here is a picture, a type of what ought to be the life of a child of God, and the wonderful possibilities that exist for the child of God. And it's in that light that we want to view these verses. So our subject is amazing possibilities in life. Now again, Isaiah paints some very graphic and amazing word pictures. In verses 1 and 2, there is the picture of the desert and the wilderness, typical of the landscape at that time. And these are transformed. The desert is seen blossoming. That's a miracle. The arid sands become a flourishing garden. There is rejoicing, there's joy, there's singing, there's beauty. And there is the glory and excellency of the Lord. There in verses 1 and 2. In verses 6 and 7, there are waters breaking out in the wilderness. There are streams in the desert. And the parched ground becomes a pool. And the thirsty land becomes springs of water. And the uninhabitable becomes grass. And then back in verse 3, the weak hands are strengthened. The feeble knees are steadied. And in verses 5 and 6, the blind see, the deaf hear, the lame leap, and the mute sing. What we read here is not natural. What we read here is not common. What we read here is the miraculous. What we read here is the result of God coming in His power. What we read here is something that's amazing, something that is miraculous, beautiful. And such should be our life. And such can be our life. So let's look first of all at the conditions that God's people can succumb to. Keep in mind that the kingdom of Judah had succumbed to horrible condition due to their sin. And in this chapter, Isaiah is speaking of a particular people. And in verse 9, they are referred to as the redeemed. And in verse 10, they are referred to as the ransomed of the Lord. Those two words, redeemed and ransomed, describe every one of us that are saved. They convey the idea that we've been atoned for, that we've been paid for, that we've been delivered, that we've been released, that we've been liberated, that we've been set free. They are indicative of an event that has taken place, two events that have taken place. A ransom being paid and the actual event of redemption. They are words of salvation. Redeemed, ransomed of the Lord. But the redeemed and the ransomed of the Lord do not always live in that glory. And our text is a graphic illustration of the terrible places where the redeemed and the ransomed of the Lord may find themselves in and even succumb to. There are some places mentioned as the result and the consequence of Judah's sin. In verse 1, notice three places. There's the wilderness, there's the solitary place, and there's the desert. The wilderness is an uncivilized place. It is an inhumane and cruel place. It is an aimless place without direction. It can be a very bewildering place, a very unsettled place, a place of restlessness, a place of discomfort, a place of great danger consisting of many pitfalls that can leave you maimed and with many injuries and wounds. And though the world in which we live is certainly a wilderness, it is also possible that the redeemed and the ransomed of the Lord may find themselves in a spiritual wilderness due to sin. There is also the solitary place, a place of isolation. Really conveys the idea that one is on their own and they are in the middle of nowhere. And though, again, the world certainly can be such a place, it is also descriptive of the condition that the redeemed and the ransomed of the Lord may succumb to. There is the desert. This is a wasteland. It's barren. It's stark. It's infertile. It's unfruitful. It's empty. It's a very bleak place. And it conveys the idea of the monotony of pathless sand. And that's where a lot of people live, even the redeemed and the ransomed of the Lord. They live in the monotony of pathless sand. And again, though the world is certainly such a place, this also is descriptive of the spiritual position that the redeemed and the ransomed of the Lord can succumb to. Notice in verse 7, there is the parched ground. Ground that has been scorched and dried up, withered and shriveled. And all through the world, we see that. But it's also descriptive, again, of the spiritual position that the redeemed and the ransomed of the Lord may succumb to. Notice also, verse 7, the thirsty land, conveying the idea of that which is hard, all dried up. And again, the world most certainly is such a place, but it is also descriptive of a spiritual condition. Notice also the habitation of dragons, conveying the idea of that which is poison and harmful and destructive. And again, very descriptive of the world, but also of the spiritual places that God's people may find themselves in. So these places, the wilderness, the solitary place, the desert, the parched ground, the thirsty land, the habitation of dragons, they speak of trouble. They speak of distress. They speak of difficulty. They speak of misery and suffering. They speak of anguish and grief and sorrow and pain and affliction due to sin. And all of this speaks of that which is spiritually sparse and deficient. And the painful truth is that the redeemed and the ransomed of the Lord can find themselves in such places. The wilderness, the solitary place, the dry ground, the desert, the parched ground, the thirsty land, the habitation of dragons. This is not what is to mark the lives of a child of God. This is not to be the identifying mark of one that has been ransomed and redeemed of the Lord. But sadly, many times it is. There are also some conditions mentioned. Isaiah speaks of some disabilities. And these, of course, are to be applied to the spiritual. Mentioned in verses 3 and 4 are the hands, the knees, and the heart. And notice that the hands, our hands are the instruments in which we work. We grasp things with our hands. But there's a problem here. The hands are weak. They're frail. They're ailing. They're decrepit. They're defective. They're deficient. And then there are the knees, related to our ability to walk, related to our ability to stand. And the knees are said to be feeble. That is, they're unsteady. They're ineffective. And then there's the heart, the inward us. Now, the heart's more important than the hands or the knees. We that are older, we may have pain in our hands. We may have knee pain. But if you go to the doctor and he says you've got a heart problem, you're not that concerned about your hand. You're not that concerned about your knees. So the most serious here is the heart, the inward us, and it's said to be fearful. That is, it's alarmed, it's panicky, it's apprehensive, it's anxious. That describes a lot of God's people. All of this, again, has spiritual application to the redeemed and the ransomed of the Lord. It's places that we can find ourselves in, conditions that we can find ourselves in. In verse 5, there are the blind. They live in spiritual darkness and ignorance. And there are the deaf. They are unable to hear the instructive and comforting voice of God. Blind and deaf. Those two things have to do with our perception. And God's people can get in a condition where their perception is all wrong. They're blind and they're deaf. In verse 6, you read of the lame. They are spiritually disabled. They lack motion. They lack activity. And then there are the dumb. They are spiritually silent. An incapacity of utterance. And again, the redeemed and the ransomed of the Lord can find themselves in any one of these conditions. So we put all of this together. The wilderness, the solitary place, the desert, the parched ground, the thirsty land, the habitation of dragons. The weak hands, the feeble knees, a fearful heart, the blind, the deaf, the lame, and the dumb. And it all has a spiritual nature. And for the southern kingdom, it is all the result of a pursuit of vanity. And what we have here is truly a very grim picture. A frightful picture. A miserable picture. It is a picture of an extremely needful and urgent situation. It's a picture of a spiritually worn down people. Very descriptive of many of God's people today. It is a picture of a people overwhelmed. And sadly, descriptive of many of God's people today. Is this our life? Is this our life? Is our life like the wilderness? Is our life like the solitary place or the desert? Is our life like the parched ground or the thirsty land or the habitation of dragons? Do the weak hands and the feeble knees and the fearful heart and the blind and the deaf and the lame and the dumb, do these things depict our life? For you and I that are redeemed and ransomed of the Lord, such does not have to be the case, and such should not be the case. And then that brings us to some glorious possibilities for the people of God. Thanks be unto God that in this day, when so many of God's people have had their hearts stolen and have fallen victim to the traps of the flesh, the world, Satan, the times in which we live. When so many have had their spiritual interest, their spiritual enthusiasm and conviction consumed by the flesh, by Satan, by the world. When so many of God's people are more willing to invest in the world than God. More invested in the world than they are the spiritual. And more dictated by the world than they are the things of God. In such a day, there is such a thing as a spiritual uplifting, as a spiritual recovery. There is such a thing as a spiritual awakening, a spiritual stirring, a spiritual energizing, a spiritual rejuvenating, a spiritual transformation. There is such a thing. In this day of instability, I'm talking about God's people, and inconsistency, and habitual hypocrisy, do-it-yourself Christianity. In this day when certain sins in the lives of God's people have become sanctified, and when many have simply an emergency religion, there is such a thing as a spiritual transformation. And I believe it is described here in Isaiah 35. And what we see here in Isaiah 35, man and religion cannot manufacture, cannot create, cannot organize, cannot legislate. No amount of human ability, no amount of human planning, no amount of methods, no amount of calculations, no amount of expense can create or bring about what is described in our text. You plan all you want to, you spend all the money you want to, you're not going to turn a desert into a blossoming garden. You can't do it. But God can. And that's what we see here in our text. Everything we read in our text is a miraculous work of God. It is the result of God showing up and doing what only He can do. What is described in our text is a glorious possibility. We don't have to settle for weak hands and feeble knees and a fearful heart. We don't have to settle for the wilderness and the solitary place and the desert and the parched ground and the thirsty land. There's more for the child of God. There are wonderful possibilities. And what we read here ought to be the life of each one of us that are saved. In this 35th chapter, Isaiah, in the context of the wilderness, the solitary place, the desert, the parched ground, the thirsty land, the habitation of dragons. In the context of the weak hands and the feeble knees and the fearful heart, And in the context of the blind and the deaf and the lame and the dumb, he preaches a message of hope and glorious possibilities. In verse 1, in the midst of the wilderness, in the solitary place in the desert, there's a gladness. There's a rejoicing. There's a fruitfulness. And there is a beauty to be had. Notice verse 1, the end of verse 1, and blossom as the rose. That ought to be our life. You think of the rose blossoming, it's pushing outward. And our life ought to be a pushing outward. A pushing outward of God. A pushing outward of salvation. A beauty for all to see. Is our life marked by gladness, rejoicing, fruitfulness, and beauty? Or is our life more marked by the wilderness, the solitary place in the desert? Do we blossom as the rose? We should. We can. Verse 2, notice the words blossom abundantly. Blossom abundantly. Then notice rejoice. Even with joy and singing. And there is glory as you read on. Spiritual splendor. Spiritual delight. And as you read on, there's excellency. That which is spiritually wonderful. Also notice there is seeing the glory of the Lord. And the excellency of our God. Does this describe our life? In verse 3, there is strengthening. And there is a steadiness to be had. What is more descriptive of our lives? Weakness, feebleness, or strength? In verse 4, there is a calmness of spirit to be had. Say to them that are of a fearful heart, be strong, fear not. There's a calmness of spirit to be had. Listen to God's people today, those who profess to be so. There's not much calm. They're as anxious or more so than the world. But we ought to have a calmness of spirit. What is more descriptive of our lives? Fearfulness or calmness? Enslavement or liberty? In verse 5 and 6, there's an ability beyond one's own ability to be had. In verses 6 and 7, there is a miraculous abundance to be had. Notice what it says. Waters, streams, a pool, springs of water, grass with reeds and rushes. And all of this is in the midst of parched ground and the thirsty land and the habitation of dragons. Again, what is more descriptive of our lives? Has the redeemed and ransomed of the Lord? Our lives can be and should be the experience of spiritual gladness, rejoicing, blossoming, beauty, strength, steadiness, calmness, deliverance, ability, abundance, safety, and by the time you get to verses 9 and 10, Zion and songs and joy. That's what ought to be our life. That can be our life. It is possible. Our lives don't have to be a spiritual wilderness. Our lives do not have to be a solitary place. Our lives do not have to be a spiritual desert. Our lives do not have to be like the parched ground and the thirsty land and the habitation of dragons. As the redeemed and the ransomed of the Lord, our lives do not have to be marked by spiritual weakness and spiritual feebleness and worry and blindness and darkness and lameness and dumbness. And if we succumb to such, and we will from time to time, you don't have to stay there. And if you stay there, it's because you choose to do so. If you stay there, it's no one's fault but your own. You can blame it on whoever you want, but until you look in the mirror and see what the real cause is, you will never get out of those places. There is, though we can succumb to such, there is the transforming power of God. In verses 1 and 2, God can change the spiritual dreariness of the wilderness and the solitary place and the desert into spiritual gladness and beauty. God can do that. You can't, but He can. He can elevate our vision from the wilderness and the solitary place and the desert to see the glory of the Lord and the excellency of our God. God can do that. In verse 3, He can transform spiritual inability to ability. In verse 4, He can transform spiritual attitudes. In verse 5, He can transform spiritual unawareness to spiritual awareness. In verse 6, He can transform the deformity. And also in verse 6, He can cause waters and springs to burst forth in the wilderness and in the desert. In verse 7, God can transform the parched ground into a pool of water. He can take the thirsty land and turn it into springs of water. He can transform the dust and the dirt into vibrant colors of plant life. God can do that. God does do that. And in verse 10, we didn't read it as part of our text, but He can cause those who were in the wilderness, who were in the solitary place, who were in the desert, to return to Zion with songs and everlasting joy upon their heads. God can. God can. God can. Because of that, glorious possibilities exist. Because God can, glorious possibilities exist with each one of our lives. Because God can, glorious possibilities exist for Faith Baptist Church and for the Lord's churches. Be sure of this. God can. God can take that which is filthy and make it clean. God can take that which is rebellious and make it obedient. God can take that which is offensive and turn it into something that's acceptable. God can take that which is broken, and there's a lot broken today. And God can take that which is broken and He can make it whole. And God can take that which is desperate and turn it into something very, very delightful. And all through our text, we see miraculous change. We see miserable conditions reversed. And we see marvelous awakening, all wrought by God. The key to what we read here in this 35th chapter is seen in verse 4. 3 words. Behold your God. That's the center of all the activity all the miraculous activity that we read of here in Isaiah 35. God. In the midst of the dreariness, in the midst of the wilderness, in the midst of the solitary place, in the midst of the desert, hear Isaiah say, behold your God. Oh, that God's people would do that today. Behold your God. And if we would only do that, even if we succumb to these places, you won't stay there. You can't. If you behold your God. So in this day, when the overall condition of those who profess salvation is more characterized by unbelief than faith, you cannot look at the overall condition of those who profess salvation and say that the overall condition is of faith. No, I don't think so. The overall condition is unbelief. In this day when the overall condition of those who profess salvation is more characterized by worry than assurance. Far more talk about worry than assurance. More characterized by frustration than peace and contentment. More characterized by discouragement and misery than joy. More characterized by doubt than godly conviction. And sadly, more characterized by the opinions of man rather than thus saith the Lord. You know, I get a little tired of hearing everybody's opinion about everything. What does God say? What does God say? The overall condition, God's people are more influenced and impacted by the world's ways than they are the Lord. That's the overall condition. I'm not saying everyone, but that is the overall condition. Oh, how we need to plead. Plead with God to come upon us in a mighty way and bring about the flourishing, the abundance, the gladness, the rejoicing, the blossoming, and the beauty of verses 1 and 2 in the lives of His people. Oh, for God to come in a mighty way, to bring strength to the exhausted. You serve God out of a wrong motive, you will eventually become spiritually exhausted. And I believe that also is descriptive of many of a child of God. They are exhausted. But oh, how we need for God to come in a mighty way, to bring strength to the exhausted, to bring steadiness to the feeble, to bring calm to the fearful, cause the spiritually blind to see, and the spiritually deaf to hear, and the spiritually lame to leap, and for the spiritually silent to sing. We need God. We need God to come in a mighty way. Such a mighty way that waters break out in the wilderness. That's a revival. For streams to flow in the desert. And for that burning sand of the desert to become a pool. And for waters to gush out in the midst of the dryness. For green grass to appear. For Him to set our feet on the highway of holiness that's later mentioned. God can. God can. Many a child of God are stuck in horrible places. And they'll say, I've tried and I've tried and I've tried. That's your problem. You're not going to get out of there in your own effort. God can. God can. The truth is, the more you try, the further you get stuck. God can bring forth spiritual beauty. We ought to want that. We ought to desire it. We ought to plead for it. In this 35th chapter, you read this chapter and there's a tone of excitement. There's a tone of expectation. That should be our life. Our life should be lived in a tone of excitement and expectation. Well, do you realize what's going on in our world today? Yes, and we ought to be excited. Because Jesus is coming. We ought to be expecting His return anytime. Everything is moving in the direction of a one-world government and the reign of Antichrist. And that's good news for the child of God. You can choose to look at it the other way and be miserable, go right ahead. But you don't have to live your life that way. God's people are fearful. They're anxious because they're looking at it the wrong way. Our lives should be lived in a tone of excitement and expectation. Plead with God to make our lives beautiful. To make our lives beautiful. If there is a rose that blossoms in the desert, I'll tell you one thing, that rose is going to stand out. You can't help but notice it. Now, if you go to a rose garden, that's a different story. But you go to a desert and you see a rose blossoming, you're going to notice that. Our lives ought to be lived noticeably for the glory of God. Our lives ought to be pushing outward the glory of God. Well, are you aware of how bad it is today? That has nothing to do with you and I, the saved. Has nothing to do with the life that we can live. Nothing. Quit making it about that and make it about God. God help us to see glorious possibilities that exist for you and I today. The song leader would come and we'll stand and